The Phantom Rickshaw, Part 2. In the fullness of time that dinner came to an end, and with genuine regret I tore myself away from Kitty, as certain as I was of my own existence that it would be waiting for me outside the door. The red-whiskered man, who had been introduced to me as Dr. Heatherlegh of Simla, volunteered to bear me company as far as our roads lay together. I accepted his offer with gratitude. My instinct had not deceived me. It lay in readiness in the mall, and, in what seemed devilish mockery of our ways, with a lighted headlamp. The red-whiskered man went to the point at once, in a manner that showed he had been thinking over it all dinner time. "I say, Pansy, what the deuce was the matter with you this evening on the Elysium Road?" The suddenness of the question wrenched an answer from me before I was aware. "That," said I, pointing to it. "That may be either DT or eyes for aught I know. Now you don't liquor. I saw as much at dinner, so it can't be DT. There's nothing whatever where you're pointing, though you're sweating and trembling with fright like a scared pony. Therefore, I conclude that it's eyes. And I ought to understand all about them. Come along home with me. I'm on the Blessington Lower Road." To my intense delight the rickshaw instead of waiting for us kept about 20 yards ahead, and this, too, whether we walked, trotted, or cantered. In the course of that long night ride I had told my companion almost as much as I have told you here. "Well, you've spoilt one of the best tales I've ever laid tongue to," said he, "but I'll forgive you for the sake of what you've gone through. Now come home and do what I tell you, and when I've cured you, young man, let this be a lesson to you to steer clear of women and indigestible food till the day of your death." The rickshaw kept steadily in front, and my red-whiskered friend seemed to derive great pleasure from my account of its exact whereabouts. "Eyes, Pansy, all eyes, brain and stomach, and the greatest of these three is stomach. You've too much conceited brain, too little stomach, and thoroughly unhealthy eyes. Get your stomach straight and the rest follows. And all that's French for a liver pill. I'll take sole medical charge of you from this hour, for you're too interesting a phenomenon to be passed over." By this time we were deep in the shadow of the Blessington Lower Road and the rickshaw came to a dead stop under a pine-clad, overhanging shale cliff. Instinctively I halted too, giving my reason. Heatherlegh rapped out an oath. "Now, if you think I'm going to spend a cold night on the hillside for the sake of a stomach come brain come eye illusion. Lord have mercy. What's that?" There was a muffled report, a blinding smother of dust just in front of us, a crack, the noise of rent boughs, and about 10 yards of the cliffside, pines, undergrowth, and all, slid down into the road below, completely blocking it up. The uprooted trees swayed and tottered for a moment like drunken giants in the gloom, and then fell prone among their fellows with a thunderous crash. Our 2 horses stood motionless and sweating with fear. As soon as the rattle of falling earth and stone had subsided, my companion muttered, "Man, if we'd gone forward we should have been 10 feet deep in our graves by now. There are more things in heaven and earth. Come home, Pansy, and thank God. I want a drink badly." We retraced our way over the church ridge, and I arrived at Dr. Heatherlegh's house shortly after midnight. His attempts towards my cure commenced almost immediately, and for a week I never left his sight. Many a time in the course of that week did I bless the good fortune which had thrown me in contact with Simla's best and kindest doctor. Day by day my spirits grew lighter and more equable. Day by day, too, I became more and more inclined to fall in with Heatherlegh's spectral illusion theory, implicating eyes, brain, and stomach. I wrote to Kitty, telling her that a slight sprain caused by a fall from my horse kept me indoors for a few days, and that I should be recovered before she had time to regret my absence. Heatherlegh's treatment was simple to a degree. It consisted of liver pills, cold water baths, and strong exercise, taken in the dusk or at early dawn, for, as he sagely observed, a man with a sprained ankle doesn't walk a dozen miles a day, and your young woman might be wondering if she saw you. At the end of the week, after much examination of pupil and pulse and strict injunctions as to diet and pedestrianism, Heatherleg dismissed me as brusquely as he had taken charge of me. Here is his parting benediction: man, I certify to your mental cure, and that's as much as to say I've cured most of your bodily ailments. Now, get your traps out of this as soon as you can, and be off to make love to Miss Kitty. I was endeavoring to express my thanks for his kindness. He cut me short. Don't think I did this because I like you. I gather that you've behaved like a blackguard all through. But, all the same, you're a phenomenon, and as queer a phenomenon as you are a blackguard. Now, go out and see if you can find the eyes, brain and stomach business again. I'll give you a lac for each time you see it. Half an hour later I was in the Mannerings' drawing room with Kitty, drunk with the intoxication of present happiness and the foreknowledge that I should never more be troubled with its hideous presence. Strong in the sense of my newfound security, I proposed a ride at once, and, by preference, a canter round Jacko. Never have I felt so well, so overladen with vitality and mere animal spirits as I did on the afternoon of the 30th of April. Kitty was delighted at the change in my appearance, and complimented me on it in her delightfully frank and outspoken manner. We left the Mannerings' house together, laughing and talking, and cantered along the Chota Simla road as of old. I was in haste to reach the Sanjoli Reservoir and there make my assurance doubly sure. The horses did their best, but seemed all too slow to my impatient mind. Kitty was astonished at my boisterousness. "Why, Jack," she cried at last, "you are behaving like a child. What are you doing?" We were just below the convent, and from sheer wantonness I was making my whaler plunge and curvet across the road as I tickled it with the loop of my riding whip. "Doing," I answered, "nothing, dear. That's just it. If you'd been doing nothing for a week except lie up, you'd be as riotous as I. Singing and murmuring in your feastful mirth. Joying to feel yourself alive. Lord over nature, Lord of the visible earth. Lord of the senses 5. My quotation was hardly out of my lips before we had rounded the corner above the convent, and a few yards further on could see across to Sanjoli. In the center of the level road stood the black and white liveries, the yellow-paneled Rickshaw and Mrs. Keith Wessington. I pulled up, looked, rubbed my eyes, and, I believe, must have said something. The next thing I knew was that I was lying face downward on the road, with Kitty kneeling above me in tears. "Has it gone, child?" I gasped. Kitty only wept more bitterly. "Has what gone? Jack dear, what does it all mean? There must be a mistake somewhere, Jack. A hideous mistake." Her last words brought me to my feet, mad, raving for the time being. "Yes, there is a mistake somewhere," I repeated, "a hideous mistake. Come and look at it." I have an indistinct idea that I dragged Kitty by the wrist along the road up to where it stood, and implored her for pity's sake to speak to it, to tell it that we were betrothed. That neither death nor hell could break the tie between us, and Kitty only knows how much more to the same effect. Now and again I appealed passionately to the terror in the rickshaw to bear witness to all I had said, and to release me from a torture that was killing me. As I talked I suppose I must have told Kitty of my old relations with Mrs. Wessington, for I saw her listen intently with white face and blazing eyes. "Thank you, Mr. Pansy," she said, "that's quite enough. Bring my horse." The grooms, impassive as Orientals always are, had come up with the recaptured horses, and as Kitty sprang into her saddle I caught hold of the bridle entreating her to hear me out and forgive. My answer was the cut of her riding whip across my face from mouth to eye, and a word or two of farewell that even now I cannot write down. So I judged, and judged rightly, that Kitty knew all, and I staggered back to the side of the rickshaw. My face was cut and bleeding, and the blow of the riding whip had raised a livid blue will on it. I had no self-respect. Just then, Heatherleg, who must have been following Kitty and me at a distance, cantered up. "Doctor," I said, pointing to my face, "here's Miss Mannering's signature to my order of dismissal and I'll thank you for that lac as soon as convenient." Heatherleg's face, even in my abject misery, moved me to laugh. "I'll stake my professional reputation," he began. "Don't be a fool," I whispered. "I've lost my life's happiness and you'd better take me home." As I spoke, the rickshaw was gone. Then I lost all knowledge of what was passing. The crest of Jacko seemed to heave and roll like the crest of a cloud and fall in upon me. 7 days later, on the 7th of May, that is to say, I was aware that I was lying in Heatherleg's room as weak as a little child. Heatherleg was watching me intently from behind the papers on his writing table. His first words were not very encouraging, but I was too far spent to be much moved by them. "Here's Miss Kitty has sent back your letters. You corresponded a good deal, you young people. Here's a packet that looks like a ring, and a cheerful sort of a note from Mannering Papa, which I've taken the liberty of reading and burning. The old gentleman's not pleased with you." "And Kitty?" I asked dully. "Rather more drawn than her father from what she says. By the same token you must have been letting out any number of queer reminiscences just before I met you. Says that a man who would have behaved to a woman as you did to Mrs. Wessington ought to kill himself out of sheer pity for his kind. She's a hot-headed little virago, your mash. We'll have it too that you were suffering from DT when that row on the Jacko Road turned up. Says she'll die before she ever speaks to you again." I groaned and turned over on the other side. "Now you've got your choice, my friend. This engagement has to be broken off, and the Mannerings don't want to be too hard on you. Was it broken through DT or epileptic fits? Sorry, I can't offer you a better exchange unless you'd prefer hereditary insanity. Say the word and I'll tell him it's fits. All Simla knows about that scene on the Ladies' Mile. Come. I'll give you 5 minutes to think over it." During those 5 minutes I believe that I explored thoroughly the lowest circles of the inferno which it is permitted man to tread on earth. And at the same time I myself was watching myself faltering through the dark labyrinths of doubt, misery, and utter despair. I wondered, as Heatherleg in his chair might have wondered, which dreadful alternative I should adopt. Presently I heard myself answering in a voice that I hardly recognized. "They're confoundedly particular about morality in these parts. Give them fits, Heatherleg, and my love. Now let me sleep a bit longer." Then my two selves joined, and it was only I, half-crazed, devil-driven I, that tossed in my bed, tracing step by step the history of the past month. "But I am in Simla," I kept repeating to myself. "I, Jack Pansy, am in Simla, and there are no ghosts here. It's unreasonable of that woman to pretend there are. Why couldn't Agnes have left me alone? I never did her any harm. It might just as well have been me as Agnes. Only I'd never have come back on purpose to kill her. Why can't I be left alone and happy?" It was high noon when I first awoke, and the sun was low in the sky before I slept as the tortured criminal sleeps on his rack, too worn to feel further pain. Next day I could not leave my bed. Heatherleg told me in the morning that he had received an answer from Mr. Mannering, and that, thanks to his, Heatherleg's, friendly offices, the story of my affliction had traveled through the length and breadth of Simla, where I was on all sides much pitied. "And that's rather more than you deserve," he concluded pleasantly, "though the Lord knows you've been going through a pretty severe mill. Never mind, we'll cure you yet, you perverse phenomenon." I declined firmly to be cured. "You've been much too good to me already, old man," said I, "but I don't think I need trouble you further." In my heart I knew that nothing Heatherleg could do would lighten the burden that had been laid upon me. With that knowledge came also a sense of hopeless, impotent rebellion against the unreasonableness of it all. There were scores of men no better than I whose punishments had at least been reserved for another world, and I felt that it was bitterly, cruelly unfair that I alone should have been singled out for so hideous a fate. This mood would in time give place to another where it seemed that the rickshaw and I were the only realities in a world of shadows, that Kitty was a ghost, that Mannering, Heatherleg, and all the other men and women I knew were all ghosts, and the great, grey hills themselves but vain shadows devised to torture me. From mood to mood I tossed backwards and forwards for 7 weary days, my body growing daily stronger and stronger, until the bedroom looking-glass told me that I had returned to everyday life, and was as other men once more. Curiously enough, my face showed no signs of the struggle I had gone through. It was pale indeed, but as expressionless and commonplace as ever. I had expected some permanent alteration, visible evidence of the disease that was eating me away. I found nothing. On the 15th of May I left Heatherlega's house at 11 o'clock in the morning, and the instinct of the bachelor drove me to the club. There I found that every man knew my story as told by Heatherleg, and was, in clumsy fashion, abnormally kind and attentive. Nevertheless I recognized that for the rest of my natural life I should be among, but not of, my fellows, and I envied very bitterly indeed the laughing coolies on the mall below. I lunched at the club, and at 4 o'clock wandered aimlessly down the mall in the vague hope of meeting Kitty. Close to the bandstand the black and white liveries joined me, and I heard Mrs. Wessington's old appeal at my side. I had been expecting this ever since I came out, and was only surprised at her delay. The phantom rickshaw and I went side by side along the Chota Simla road in silence. Close to the bazaar, Kitty and a man on horseback overtook and passed us. For any sign she gave I might have been a dog in the road. She did not even pay me the compliment of quickening her pace, though the rainy afternoon had served for an excuse. So Kitty and her companion, and I and my ghostly light o' love, crept round Jacko in couples. The road was streaming with water, the pines dripped like roof pipes on the rocks below, and the air was full of fine, driving rain. 2 or 3 times I found myself saying to myself almost aloud, "I'm Jack Pansy on leave at Simla. Every day, ordinary Simla. I mustn't forget that, I mustn't forget that." Then I would try to recollect some of the gossip I had heard at the club, the prices of so-and-so's horses, anything, in fact, that related to the workaday Anglo-Indian world I knew so well. I even repeated the multiplication table rapidly to myself, to make quite sure that I was not taking leave of my senses. It gave me much comfort, and must have prevented my hearing Mrs. Wessington for a time. Once more I wearily climbed the convent slope and entered the level road. Here Kitty and the man started off at a canter, and I was left alone with Mrs. Wessington. "Agnes," said I, "will you put back your hood and tell me what it all means?" The hood dropped noiselessly and I was face to face with my dead and buried mistress. She was wearing the dress in which I had last seen her alive, carried the same tiny handkerchief in her right hand, and the same card case in her left. A woman 8 months dead with a card case. I had to pin myself down to the multiplication table, and to set both hands on the stone parapet of the road to assure myself that that at least was real. "Agnes," I repeated, "for pity's sake tell me what it all means." Mrs. Wessington leant forward, with that odd, quick turn of the head I used to know so well, and spoke. If my story had not already so madly overleaped the bounds of all human belief I should apologize to you now. As I know that no one, no, not even Kitty, for whom it is written as some sort of justification of my conduct, will believe me, I will go on. Mrs. Wessington spoke and I walked with her from the Sanjoli road to the turning below the Commander-in-Chief's house as I might walk by the side of any living woman's rickshaw, deep in conversation. The second most tormenting of my moods of sickness had suddenly laid hold upon me, and like the prince in Tennyson's poem, I seemed to move amid a world of ghosts. There had been a garden party at the Commander-in-Chief's, and we too joined the crowd of homeward-bound folk. As I saw them then it seemed that they were the shadows, impalpable fantastic shadows, that divided for Mrs. Wessington's rickshaw to pass through. What we said during the course of that weird interview I cannot, indeed, I dare not, tell. Heatherlega's comment would have been a short laugh and a remark that I had been mashing a brain stomach chimera. It was a ghastly and yet in some indefinable way a marvelously dear experience. Could it be possible, I wondered, that I was in this life to woo a second time the woman I had killed by my own neglect and cruelty? I met Kitty on the homeward road, a shadow among shadows. If I were to describe all the incidents of the next fortnight in their order, my story would never come to an end, and your patience would be exhausted. Morning after morning and evening after evening the ghostly Rickshaw and I used to wander through Simla together. Wherever I went, there the 4 black and white liveries followed me and bore me company to and from my hotel. At the theater I found them amid the crowd of yelling Japanese, outside the club veranda, after a long evening of whist, at the birthday ball, waiting patiently for my reappearance, and in broad daylight when I went calling. Save that it cast no shadow, the rickshaw was in every respect as real to look upon as one of wood and iron. More than once, indeed, I have had to check myself from warning some hard-riding friend against cantering over it. More than once I have walked down the mall deep in conversation with Mrs. Wessington to the unspeakable amazement of the passers-by. Before I had been out and about a week I learnt that the fit theory had been discarded in favor of insanity. However, I made no change in my mode of life. I called, rode, and dined out as freely as ever. I had a passion for the society of my kind which I had never felt before. I hungered to be among the realities of life, and at the same time I felt vaguely unhappy when I had been separated too long from my ghostly companion. It would be almost impossible to describe my varying moods from the 15th of May up to today. The presence of the rickshaw filled me by turns with horror, blind fear, a dim sort of pleasure, and utter despair. I dared not leave Simla, and I knew that my stay there was killing me. I knew, moreover, that it was my destiny to die slowly and a little every day. My only anxiety was to get the penance over as quietly as might be. Alternately I hungered for a sight of Kitty and watched her outrageous flirtations with my successor, to speak more accurately, my successors, with amused interest. She was as much out of my life as I was out of hers. By day I wandered with Mrs. Wessington almost content. By night I implored heaven to let me return to the world as I used to know it. Above all these varying moods lay the sensation of dull, numbing wonder that the seen and the unseen should mingle so strangely on this earth to hound one poor soul to its grave. August 27th. Heatherleg has been indefatigable in his attendance on me, and only yesterday told me that I ought to send in an application for sick leave. An application to escape the company of a phantom. A request that the government would graciously permit me to get rid of 5 ghosts and an airy rickshaw by going to England. Heatherleg's proposition moved me to almost hysterical laughter. I told him that I should await the end quietly at Simla, and I am sure that the end is not far off. Believe me that I dread its advent more than any word can say, and I torture myself nightly with 1,000 speculations as to the manner of my death. Shall I die in my bed decently and as an English gentleman should die, or, in one last walk on the Mall, will my soul be wrenched from me to take its place for ever and ever by the side of that ghastly phantasm? Shall I return to my old lost allegiance in the next world, or shall I meet Agnes Lothinghearn bound to her side through all eternity? Shall we two hover over the scene of our lives till the end of time? As the day of my death draws nearer, the intense horror that all living flesh feels towards escaped spirits from beyond the grave grows more and more powerful. It is an awful thing to go down quick among the dead with scarcely 1/2 of your life completed. It is 1,000 times more awful to wait as I do in your midst, for I know not what unimaginable terror. Pity me, at least on the score of my delusion, for I know you will never believe what I have written here. Yet as surely as ever a man was done to death by the powers of darkness I am that man. In justice, too, pity her. For as surely as ever woman was killed by man, I killed Mrs. Wessington. And the last portion of my punishment is even now upon me.